Could Kwesi trade up? Could he trade down? What is in the making of a draft trade? And what is with all of those charts? Let's talk about how those charts came to be here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that? 3, 1, 2, 3. You like it?
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in a math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. I want to extend a special shout out to my hashtag everydayers people who listen to Locked On Vikings each and every day. Love y'all. You can find this show wherever you find your favorite podcasts, including YouTube and even Amazon, Fire, or Roku. Just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. My apologies for this show being a little bit late. If you are an everydayer and you were expecting this in your feed when you woke up and it wasn't there, that's my bad. Some life got in the way. But we're here now. So let's talk about draft trades. This is sort of a show I do every year around this time, and it's always good to just rehash the content here because it's how draft trades come to pass, and understanding the dynamics of a draft trade, I think, will help you not only better predict them, but better understand why they can be so different. So let me begin. We'll rip the Band-Aid off and talk about how this kind of heuristic came to be. So you've probably seen, if you listen to this show, you've probably heard me talk about draft trade charts. I like to use the Rich Hill chart before the draft when evaluating or when trying to predict trades. It's the best one at predicting trades because it is built off of previous trades. The other ones are built off of the results of trades, who won trades. But the Rich Hill chart is built off of just like what trades happened. So I think it's better at predicting and better at sort of giving you an understanding of, hey, how much would it cost to trade up to this one, or trade? How much would you get if you traded down from here to there? It is that one's a relatively new technology when it comes to draft trade charts. Draft trade charts were around since probably the early 90s, at least the late 80s. And you're not going to like how they first happened. You may know of a Jimmy Johnson trade chart, which was kind of the first one that we sort of publicly knew about. So when Jimmy Johnson took over the Cowboys, they were in a lot of turmoil. In the late 80s, the Cowboys were ailing. It was very bad. And they were having a dreadful 1989 season. They had one good player on their team, and they figured they were going to flip him for assets and rebuild from the ground up. That player was Herschel Walker. That trading team was the Minnesota Vikings. I'm sorry, we got to talk about the Herschel Walker trade for a second. All right. If you're curious, by the way, about what happened there, I do have the history doc. You can just watch it there. Patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. But basically, the Cowboys were actually trying to trade him to the Browns, and then they called the Vikings to say, "Hey, we'll give you this package." And, hey, think on it. You're going to need to answer by, evening and think on it. And then they were going to go back to the Browns and say, hey, we offered the Vikings this package. Can you beat it? And they were just trying to basically use the Vikings as a pot sweetener to get the Browns to pay more for Herschel Walker. And the Vikings, who were going through their own whole thing at the moment, they were on a little losing streak. Mike Lynn was in charge at the time. He was panicking. He made a number of mistakes. This was probably the biggest one. I say probably. There might have been other bigger mistakes. Watch the history doc. That dude was a card and a half. But because of the deadline, because of essentially Jimmy Johnson told him, like, look, this deal's gonna get done very, very soon. You have to say yes very fast if you're gonna say yes, essentially, because hey, I'm about to offer, we're really negotiating with the Browns. If you want to get in, you got to get in fast. And he basically didn't think about it. He didn't. I don't think he even read terms of the trade. It was deeply complicated, as you know, with all kinds of conditional draft picks and stuff. And he made a mistake. He didn't think that the Cowboys would approach the deal the way they did. the way the deal worked was, this player or a conditional pick if we cut this player, and he just cut all the players and took all the picks, but the Vikings didn't get the players back. So it wasn't this pick or a player. He lost the pick and the player, and then everything kind of spiraled from there. So part of what made that trade happen for Jimmy Johnson and a lot of the draft trades, because when Jimmy Johnson, after the Herschel Walker trade, he didn't just pick with all of those draft picks. He traded them around. He traded down. I don't think he actually selected at any of those Vikings picks at their natural spot. He moved them up. He moved them down. And how he did that was with a trade chart that came out later. It is probably the most common one you still see. It is the one that that TV uses. It's the one that mainstream NFL media still refers to very often. You need somebody who's going to be a little bit more willing to go a little more off the beaten path to reference any other trade chart. And it is also by far, and I say this absolutely objectively, this has been proven extensively, and there is not really any debating it. It is by far the worst trade chart. It is the worst representation of value. It is horrible at predicting trades. I might as well have the Rabbits pick a series of descending numbers and put that on a trade chart, and it might genuinely be a better tool than the Jimmy Johnson trade chart. So after a while, when the real mainstream analytics movement of sort of the 2010s happened, I mean, analytics in football has been around for a lot longer than that, but really the mainstream movement that we sort of recognize today got their teeth into it. Other stuff started to come out, other versions of the same idea. But the general logic of, the first round pick is worth this many points, the second pick is worth this many points, the third pick is worth this many points, and a fifth rounder is worth about the difference between a first rounder and a blah blah blah. And so if you want to trade, if you want to trade up from 23 to 17, you have to pay about a third rounder to do, or whatever the trade charts say. That logic, that framework, is credited often to Jimmy Johnson, and it's because of the dynasty the Cowboys built in the 90s, fueled by that old Herschel Walker trade. Thanks, Mike Lynn, and for also almost getting the team moved after you left. Look, watch the history doc again. That dude was wild. But let's talk about some of the other charts that came to pass, and then just some sort of musings as well on draft trades and trade charts and whatnot. Before I do any of that, though, if you want to try to build your version of the 90s Cowboys dynasty, or whatever, you could be the Salt Lizards. I don't care. You could go to Ultimate Football GM. It's a phone game that is basically a team management simulator. It's drafting players, hiring staff, negotiating contracts, staying under the salary cap. Someone sent me a screenshot the other day that somehow they had gotten every pick in the top 10 of the entire draft. That's broken. So if you want to break the game, download the game. And by the way, you can get 100% free boost to your team when you enter promo code Locked On in the game store. And then break it, and then send me the screenshots of how you broke it. I want to see you trotting out 400 quarterbacks or something. I want to see you do wild stuff. But you could also do less wild stuff that's kind of fun, like draft a player, win a bunch of Super Bowls with them. That player retires. Hire that player onto your staff and win more Super Bowls that way. Whatever you do, go to ultimate-gm.com or just search out Ultimate Pro Football GM on the App Store. Ultimate Pro Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Shout out once again to my hashtag everydayers here on the Locked On Vikings podcast. So after a while, this Jimmy Johnson trade chart thing, I think people outside of football, at least I can't really speak to when people inside of football noticed it because I'm not. But outside of football, at least, people started to notice this. And the first one that I know of that really came out and became a true competitor is the Harvard trade chart. It was built off of approximate value, I believe was a stat before this chart was. And you can find approximate value on like Pro Football Reference. It's just a super quick and dirty way of trying to measure player value across positions. So to be able to compare, an offensive lineman to a quarterback or a safety to a running back. And it uses like how many snaps the guy played and accolades like all pro and stuff. And then if there are stats for that position, it has some kind of matrix for that. But it's approximate, and it's very much meant to be this sort of overall, you kind of have to zoom super far out before you get rid of all the noise to make that like a good measure of who's good. But for this, it worked okay. And essentially that study, it was a Harvard study that looked at the approximate value of players across the league, where they were drafted, and compared them, right? How well on average does the first overall pick do? How well on average does the 39th overall pick do? And comparing them, and then smooth it all out a little bit with some math, and you end up getting a curve and a different point structure. What that found was that the Jimmy Johnson trade chart was overvaluing draft position by a lot, which meant that it found basically any time there was a draft trade, with few exceptions, the trading down team ended up with more AV than the trading up team. And logically, that makes a little bit of sense. You think about stuff that kind of older trades, like the Ricky Williams trade, right? Saints trade their whole draft up to get to Washington, I believe, to get Ricky Williams in 1999. Ricky Williams was a good player, but they traded an entire draft. It's probably really easy for Washington to get more than Ricky Williams with a whole draft. That's an extreme example, but you think about someone like Garrett Bradbury, and what if the Vikings had traded down and picked twice in the second round? Maybe they get Elton Jenkins instead, and it would have been a better player, right? Like, how often does that kind of thing happen? How often does a Jerry Jeudy go before a Justin Jefferson, or an Alex Leatherwood go before a Christian Darrisaw? And so having more picks, having more bites at the apple sort of hedges your bets. Anybody who's experienced in investment understands this, right? Which is why I think Kwesi Adofo-Mensah was so eager to trade down that he actually took bad value with the Lions, because having more picks was still like kind of worth it. But anybody who's involved in investment will tell you to spread things out, right? Invest in an index. That's 500 stocks, rather than investing in one stock you really believe in and putting all your eggs in one basket. Diversify. That's the word I was looking for. So that came out and took a while to kind of really find popularity. But when you get into more modern times and the discourse, I guess, around trades, basically the accepted community line right now is don't trade up unless it's for a quarterback. And a lot of other charts are out there that really support that. I think the only chart that really doesn't, I mean, of course, eventually it becomes cheap enough to trade up, right? If I'm going from pick 23 to 3 and I'm giving you a 7th round pick, that's worth it, right? But that's never going to happen. And what it will cost to move up to 3 will probably not be worth it, because this is a fairly static market. It's a little bit of a different market when a QB, though, is on the market. But that is where we get charts that we all can use today. And you can use lots of different ones to answer lots of different questions. Like the Rich Hill chart is made from previous trades. It is made from what draft trades actually happened, and essentially reverse engineering a market from that. If it cost picks 32 and 59 to go up, or 32 and 66, I think, to go up to 12, then that gets logged in the data set, and you log every single trade that's ever happened, and eventually you actually get a pretty smooth, stable data set. What's interesting about the Rich Hill chart is when you add quarterback trades, they work differently. It costs more to move up, and that makes sense, right? If you are a team trading down, if you're Houston sitting at 12, then there are 2 teams calling you about Will Levis, and you know that that's their quarterback. Like, they need that. If they miss that quarterback, the entire direction of the franchise has to shift to accommodate for that. They're going to be really interested in it. So while it, would normally cost just a first round pick to move up to 12, you can say, well, I need you to give me a first and a third because I know you need the quarterback. Give me a first and a third, and it can't really say no. So yeah, it costs more to move up with a quarterback, and Rich Hill actually has a separate trade chart for that express purpose for quarterback trades. There is the Spielberger-Fitzgerald chart, which is a sort of PFF / over the cap tandem invention kind of that is built off of the contract value of and like the rookie wage scale essentially, which sort of approximates how this player is valued, which is in a sense the most practical one, because that's the way that the NFL and the NFLPA, when they discussed what the rookie wage scale would be, that is essentially a declaration of, we think the 33rd pick overall is worth this much money. We think the 56th pick overall is worth this much money. So let's take that and normalize it into a trade chart. In a very, very practical way. And it also ends up reflecting results pretty well. There are other trade charts. I believe PFF has their own that's like built off of results in the same logic as the Harvard trade chart, but using better stats than approximate value. And there's other analytics charts out there. I just refer to them as the nerd charts because while they do have some small differences, they will typically bear out similar results in most situations, and you can kind of use any of them. But the nerd charts are going to be the ones you will be unsurprised to learn that the nerd charts are the highest on trading down and the lowest on trading up. Essentially, the better math you do and the more you study this, the more you find that teams who trade down just tend to get better results. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the logic that I talked about before is universal, right? The team that like the RG3 trade is a great example of how it can go wrong for both teams, right? You trade up, you get a quarterback, they put all their eggs in one basket, and that basket got hurt. You have no control over that. Well, I guess maybe you do if you count taking care of your field, Washington, but it's neither here nor there. But if you look at the players that the Rams got in trading down in 2012, pretty crappy. It didn't really work out for them as well because they just whiffed on a lot. But it's a lot harder for them to whiff on. It's a lot harder to whiff on 4 picks than it is to whiff on 1, and that's sort of the logic. But also, what that really reflects is the difference between something like the Rich Hill chart, which represents the market. That's the price tag on a trade. And then the nerd charts, which is the expected result of that trade. You take the difference between those two charts, and you kind of get the sense that trading down is better. That the market undervalues lower picks. It overvalues draft position. That's really the way that I want to, the thing I want you to take away from. The NFL as a whole overvalues draft position. And I think we kind of get lost in that narrative a little bit too, looking at how mad people were when the Vikings slid down 20 picks in the first round. That's a long way to go. They got a lot for it, but it's a long way to go. But it's just draft position. You still got a first rounder, right? It's just a later first rounder. And navigating talent cliffs and stuff is really a better way, I think, to look at trades than just on these trade charts. They're a tool, not a rule. That's the way you got to think about a lot of this stuff. It's a tool. It's a very helpful tool, but it's not a law. It's a tool, not a rule. But let's kind of keep the conversation going now into a more theoretical place and talk about how we can use these charts and analyze draft trades, how I at least prefer to analyze draft trades. So the first thing I want to talk about is when to trade up, because, okay, if trading up is bad, why would anyone ever do it, right? Are teams just stupid? Are they wrong? And I think sometimes we get a little bit of hubris and we go, that team's just dumb. Well, no, they were going for something, right? Here's the way I see it. Let's say you are up at, let's keep the numbers really simple. Let's say you're up at pick 10 and there is a top 4 player who is falling and he is available at pick 8. So there's a top 4 player at pick 8 and you're 2 picks later. And you're worried that the team in front of you is going to take that top 4 player, but you could get a top 4 player with this top 10 pick. I mean, think about that. Think about you picked 10th. That's the Saints were in the 10th spot this year, and the Eagles have their pick, but the Saints were in the 10th spot this year. The Saints had like an exceedingly mediocre season. They could pick all the way to 4th. The Colts had a catastrophic season. They basically tanked, and they got the 4th. But you could get a tanking player, right? The 4th best player at the 10th spot. That's huge value. So you trade up. And yeah, it's inefficient to trade the 10th best selection opportunity for the 8th best selection opportunity. But if you're paying the price it costs to move up from 10 to 8, and you're getting functionally the 4th best player, you're getting from 10 to 4, now that's a good deal. You just have to be right about who is who. And of course, that's where the game really is. And ultimately, I get a little bit nihilistic about all this stuff when it's like, well, you know what? What really matters is that the guy you picked doesn't suck. If, nobody's going to care about the trade down if Lewis Cine is good and Kyle Hamilton isn't, right? So that's the first thing I want to talk about with like trades up and trades down. Think about where that player had to be on the board for a trade like that to make sense when you see teams trade up. Now, not every team uses the same draft chart. And there are actually people out there who are trying to reverse engineer based on the trades that teams agree to, who uses what chart, right? Who spends a lot to trade up? Maybe they still use the Jimmy Johnson chart. A team like the Vikings with Kwesi, it's pretty clear he uses some iteration of a nerd chart. He probably has his own, and a lot of teams probably have their own trade charts that are built by their own analytics departments. But as evidenced by that Lions trade that everybody got so mad about last year, with Jameson Williams going from 12 to 32 and getting, I think, it was like pick 66 or something. I don't remember the exact details, and it's not important for this conversation. But if you remember on the trade charts that the Lions underpaid, and that was the problem with it. The Vikings, could have gotten equivalent value. They could have pumped things up. They could have probably eked a lot more out of the Lions, but they didn't. They agreed to the trade anyways, and the fact that they were willing to do that tells me that they have some version of a nerd chart that really, really values trading down, that is more focused on having gotten the most value when all is said and done than on reflecting the market as it is constructed. They probably think that the NFL overvalues draft position, and they probably are willing to take lesser deals because they still feel like they're exploiting that. That's the way I think Kwesi approaches draft trades. Now, things get a lot more complicated when you think about players, and we might have to do that going into this draft because of Dalvin Cook. All the reporting out there is very confused on Dalvin Cook. And I think that they are holding things close to this. I'm going to get super speculative here, by the way. This is not reporting. This is not information that you can take to the bank at all. I am reading tea leaves. I might as well put on my little tinfoil hat. I'm going to put on my little tinfoil hat. I do not want anyone to take me seriously right now. And if you're listening to this and not watching it, watch on YouTube. I've got a little tinfoil hat. It has horns on it, and it is falling apart. So I don't think anything's going to happen with Za'Darius Smith. All the reporting is basically that there's all silence on Za'Darius Smith's fronts, or silence on all fronts. And I think that is a situation that will be resolved after the draft. I think the front office is just focusing on the draft right now because they know that the Za'Darius Smith thing does not, there's nothing that can happen in the draft that would be affected by that. I guess if you traded him away, you'd want an edge rusher more or whatever, but they do have still Danielle Hunter and Marcus Davenport on the roster. With Dalvin Cook, the reporting has been a little sketchier. Some people say that he's basically already been traded, or he's been informed he's not going to be part of the team anymore. Some people have kind of said that, we don't really know. People have gone back and forth on whether or not they expect Dalvin Cook to be a Viking. Here's what I think. All right. I think that there are trades in place that we don't know if they're going to materialize. And this is how a lot of trades materialize. This is how the Lions trade with the Vikings materialized. They negotiated this before the draft. This was not like a panicky move. This was not like a, let's just quick call up like in the movie Draft Day and you call them up and you negotiate it on the fly. No. This was, hey, we have agreed to a deal, and if the board falls a certain way, we'll execute the deal. I think a deal like that has been negotiated with Dalvin Cook. some kind of trade. If the board falls a certain way, this might be a day 2 or a day 3 thing, because I don't think Dalvin Cook has a ton of trade value as an older running back with a big contract and an injury history. I think the Vikings are mostly just looking to dump the contract. If I were a guessing man, if I were a tinfoil hat conspiracy kind of guy, I would guess that there is some kind of deal involving Dalvin Cook. So we have to talk about the actual practicality of trading a player in the middle of the draft as part of draft capital. So first, we have to kind of decide what we think that player is worth draft capital wise. And I like to look to historic trades and stuff to do this, but considering Dalvin Cook's situation, again, I think most of the value the Vikings are getting is money. They would trade away, they would save $8 million on the cap doing this. It would go most of the way towards signing their draft picks, especially because they don't have a lot of draft picks this year. So that's going to mean that many fewer rookie contracts to sign. Considering that and running back value in general, and how many quality years does Dalvin Cook have left, right? He's probably still quality now, but are you getting 2 years, 3 years? You're probably not getting 5 years. He'd be like in his 30s, and running backs just don't typically last to their 30s at a high level of play. So all of that into consideration, let's call it a fifth. Maybe you think he's worth more. Maybe, man, what? He's like a top 10 running back or whatever. He's got to be worth more than a fifth. Or maybe you're like, running backs aren't worth anything. He's worth a seventh, right? He's expensive. He's an albatross. He's a burden, whatever. Substitute whatever you think. But what I will do usually is I'll say, okay, Dalvin Cook worth a fifth. And when I think about adding Dalvin Cook to a trade, I will go to the middle-ish of whatever trade chart I'm using of the 5th round and say he's worth that many points, and then do my math from there. That's how I would incorporate players. And if you want to incorporate a player like Zadarius Smith, just do the same calculus. What do you think he would be worth? He's on a pretty cheap deal. He probably comes with doing your own extension. You have control over that. He's also a little older. He's also got an injury history. Factor all that in. If you want to really daydream about buck wild trades up to 3 for Justin Jefferson, okay, what's Justin Jefferson worth? 2 firsts, 3 firsts? Is that enough to get you up to 3? Depends on the chart, so on and so forth. The other thing, a rule of thumb I should mention, this is something that I mention every time I do a mock draft with future picks. Rule of thumb, future pick is worth this year pick a round down. So if you want to look at how much a second round, if you want to trade a second next year as part of a trade up to get a quarterback, I can take off the tinfoil now, then look at this year about what a third would be. Now there's some there's some argument, some debate over where in the third round. Some people say, last pick in the round. Some people say just do a middle pick in the round, because you don't know where that second pick will actually land in the draft, because you don't know how well the Vikings will do in the next season. So it's really an approximation and a rule of thumb. But ultimately, by the time everything is said and done, you're probably not using that trade chart. And again, anyways, you're probably focused on what, the Vikings can't do because they have a second round pick or whatever. I hope this was at least somewhat informative for you. I know a lot of people already knew all this stuff, but I find all of the different draft trade charts and all of the different attempts to quantify and make sense of, picks 32 and 117 for picks 66, 52 and a third next year. Like that calculus is really difficult. And so these are great tools, but again, tool, not a rule. These trades can totally, like a trade up can totally work out. You can have Julio Jones trades. It can totally happen. It helps you make sense of things. But it is not, if it doesn't match the trade chart, it's not necessarily a bad trade. It just means that there's probably something that chart is not built to factor in that you have to do yourself with your human brain. Use your human brains. That's the lesson of the episode. I will talk to you tomorrow. So thank you all for hanging out here on the Locked On Vikings podcast. Check out Locked On Draft Scouting with the draft dudes, Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino. That'll help you get a sense for all the players, more players than I'm going to be able to talk about on this one. Go check it out. And again, thank you to my everydayers. See y'all tomorrow. And as always, Skol.